Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building a $5 trillion Economy, the National Infrastructure Pipeline in India. My name is Rohini Sanyal, and I'm a research economist at the ISI Emerging Markets Group. I would like to thank all of you for joining today. I'm happy to see attendees from so many different countries. Today's discussion will center around India's dream of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025. We at the ISI Emerging Markets Group, together with experts of CARE Advisory Research and Training, will explore why India is focusing on infrastructure development and how the National Infrastructure Pipeline plans to propel the economy towards this $5 trillion target. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists. Sudeep Saral is the Chief Executive Officer at CARE Advisory Research and Training. He is an infrastructure and credit risk specialist with more than 25 years of experience in credit ratings, infrastructure finance, and corporate financial risk assessment. Sudeep has played an instrumental role in building of the National Infrastructure Pipeline, from institutionalization of the project data framework, identification of the projects, undertaking interactions with various stakeholders from NITI Aayog and various line ministries, and launching the National Infrastructure Pipeline. Apart from this, he has worked on projects with clients such as the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, large Indian corporates, financial institutions, and governments in India and Southeast Asia. Along with Sudeep, we have Sushmita Majumdar, who is the director at CARE Advisory Research and Training. Sushmita is a project finance, structured finance, credit rating, and infrastructure advisory specialist with around 20 years of experience in roads and highways, ports, real estate, urban and municipal infrastructure development, concessions, and public-private partnerships across India. She has worked on projects with clients such as Asian Development Bank, World Bank, state governments, financial institutions, and large Indian corporates and funds. We also have Tushar Shah joining us today, who is a director at CARE Advisory Research and Training. Tushar has around 15 years of experience in industry assessment, business assessment, policy and regulatory framework assessment for corporates and infrastructure projects across sectors like power, renewables, telecom, oil and gas, ports, airports, amongst others. He specializes in corporate finance, project finance, structured finance, including detailed financial modeling and transaction advisory. Now, before we get started, with some of you who are not familiar with what we do at ISI Emerging Markets Group, we've been in the business of providing information on emerging markets for over 25 years. We have two brands, CIC Data and EMIS, that specialize in providing high-quality emerging markets content. CIC Data provides macroeconomic data on more than 200 economies, while EMIS focuses on providing company, industry, and country research on emerging economies. Our partners for today's event, CARE Advisory Research and Training, has more than 2 decades of experience in credit risk analytics. The group is led by CARE Ratings, which is the second largest rating agency in India and has been in the industry for over 27 years. CARE Ratings has a rated debt of over 151 trillion as on March 2021. CARE Advisory Research and Training Limited is a fully owned subsidiary of CARE Ratings Limited. They provide in-depth research on over 50 sectors and specialize in providing advisory services across infrastructure, manufacturing, and stressed assets. In addition, they also provide a wide range of services in ESG assessment and advisory. Now, before we start, I would like to mention a couple of points that will help us interact during the session. During today's webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. You can submit your questions in writing using the question panel on your right. We will answer as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end. We also have a handout section just above the question panel where we have uploaded our presentation for today. You can download it for your reference. And lastly, at the end of the webinar, we have a short survey to capture your feedback and expectation. With that said, let's see what's on the agenda today. We will center the discussion around 4 main topics. First, we look at the motivation behind the introduction of the National Infrastructure Pipeline that was introduced in 2020, followed by a discussion about the key aspects of this program, and then finally take a deep dive into specific details on 2 sectors, the roads and the renewable energy sector. Starting off with, in fiscal year 2021, that is the year ending in March 2021, India's nominal GDP was rupees 197 trillion. That roughly translates to around 2.6 trillion US dollars. Now, in terms of real GDP, this was about 2.7 trillion US dollars. While the pandemic has shrunk the economic output in fiscal year 2021, it also triggered a slew of reforms that are expected to help the economy bounce back even stronger. Even then, the $5 trillion dream is by fiscal year 2025 is a really ambitious one, and one that would require a growth rate of more than 10% annually, assuming that the rupee doesn't depreciate against the dollar substantially. However, the government's commitment to realizing this target can be seen from many instances, especially the launch of the National Infrastructure Pipeline. The infrastructure development has become a center point in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis due to its high multiplier effect for the economy. The National Infrastructure Pipeline, in that respect, is a comprehensive plan to construct world-class infrastructure in India by fiscal year 2025, and it has a total outlay of 111 trillion rupees. And besides the usual, transport and power infrastructure, the pipeline also encompasses communication infrastructure, rural development, agricultural infrastructure, and even social infrastructure in the form of education, health, sports, and tourism-based developments. The pipeline has been designed to meet the rapid urbanization and evolving demographics of India, as well as strengthen supply chains and meet sustainable development goals by the year 2030. All of this is aimed at creating this virtuous cycle of investment, employment, income generation, and growth. Now, there is plenty of literature on how infrastructure can aid economic growth. And in that context, China actually makes a very good example. The country has spent more than 40% of its GDP on gross fixed capital formation over the past decade, as you can see in this chart here. And as of 2020, the size of the economy is $14.7 trillion. And amongst the BRIC nations, India is actually the second in terms of spending on gross fixed capital formation. And even though this share has decreased, from 34% to about 26% in 2021, well, from 2012 and now in fiscal year 2021, there is still, a considerable room for improvement that calls for greater, fixed capital formation. Now, even though the gross fixed capital formation as a share of GDP has declined over the past decade, the actual values are now nearing the pre-pandemic levels, as you can see in the chart on your left. In the April to June quarter of 2021, India spent around 10.2 trillion rupees on fixed capital formation, which marked about 55% increase, thanks to low base. However, India needs to spend close to 4.5 trillion on infrastructure development by 2025. But the current spending is actually lesser than $100 billion. So, but at the same time, the budgeted capital expenditure has increased quite substantially by 34% year on year. But if you see by July 2021, this was only at 23% of the total budgeted value for fiscal year 2022. Now, this could be a result of the second wave, which mandated these local lockdowns across the country, and a lot of work got stalled. But again, in the same breath, it's interesting to note that for fiscal year 2021, the capital expenditure actually outpaced the budget value and was at 103% of the total estimate, the budget estimate. And this, provides us hope that the pace of capital expenditure will pick up over the rest of the financial year, and that will translate into greater benefits for the economy and the overall. Now, coming to foreign investments, India attracted a total of $80.1 billion in fiscal year 2021, out of which the foreign direct investment was about $55 billion. While overall investment has increased in fiscal year 2021 by about 80%, the FDI actually declined by around 2%. Now, despite this decline, FDI in terms of actual value has been greater as compared to that between fiscal year 2014 and 2019, as evident in this graph again. And in terms of, if I look at the breakup of foreign investments in fiscal year 2021, we'll see that construction and infrastructure activities here in green have actually, lagged behind some of the other sectors. And even then, the share of the of construction infrastructure activity in total investment has picked up from 5% in fiscal year 2020 to 15% in 2021. And if I only look at the outermost ring, which is Q1 of fiscal year 2022, we'll see that the construction and infrastructure activity is actually fifth in the line, but there's only one quarter. So, we have to wait and watch how it picks up for over the rest of the year. Now, coming to the next slide, this is a small heat map that measures how the infrastructure activity is doing. I call it the infrastructure activity scorecard. And here we can see how some of the industries, the indicators are working out. So if I look at core infrastructure industries index, we are seeing that in the April to June quarter, it's picking up thanks to the low base and also the economic recovery. And here we can see national highways awarded has declined, but at the same time, the construction has seen a pickup. Railway capital expenditure again is in the green, so that shows a pickup in that sense as well. So on and so forth. So on the overall, if I look at this heat map, the sense is that the infrastructure activity is picking up, and we are going to see a lot more benefits in the year forward. So with that, I would want to I want to hand it over to Sudeep, who will take you more deeply through what the National Infrastructure Pipeline contains and what it does. So Sudeep, handing it over to you.
Thank you, Rohini. Before I get into the National Infrastructure Pipeline and the details of it, let me spend a minute talking about the genesis of the NIP and why the creation of the NIP has been given so much of importance by the government and our policymakers. So we all know that deficit in infrastructure has been one of the primary growth constraints in India. And in that context, when we create new infrastructure and when we upgrade existing infrastructure, that can really be the key to raising India's competitiveness and also help us in the path towards the $5 trillion economy. When we look at infrastructure and when we have the supply side additions to infrastructure, what it does is that it creates not just the near term and medium term GDP enabling environment for that GDP to happen, but also it results in a higher potential rate of GDP for any country. Infrastructure is also labor absorbing. It boosts employment and therefore income generation, and it further spurs domestic demand. So all this really helps in unleashing a virtuous cycle of higher investments, growth, employment generation, and of course it improves our global competitive advantage. Now, one aspect about infrastructure that we need to keep in mind is that there is a lead time associated with infra development, and that's because a lot of time is spent in project preparation. There is a financial closure that happens, and then it may take anywhere up to 2 years or even 3 years of construction for complex infrastructure projects. And we have seen many projects suffer from time and cost overruns, leading to such projects becoming unviable. There is therefore a need to plan and monitor the progress and ensure adherence to timelines. And there is also a need to attract the private sector with the right kind of capabilities, the appropriate kind of financiers, because financial risk appetites can vary very, very greatly depending on whether we are in the construction phase or in the operational phase. And that is really the genesis, the need to create a robust pipeline of bankable and shovel-ready projects. And I believe the NIP is a step in that direction. Now, what is really the NIP? If you look at it, it is for the first time ever that we have a bottoms-up compilation of nearly 7,000 infrastructure projects costing rupees 100 crores or more. The total expenditure that is envisaged from fiscal 2020 to 2025 over a 6-year period is 111 trillion or 111 lakh crores. And if you look at this graph here on the right hand side, the pie chart, this spend is including projects from both economic infrastructure sectors as well as social infrastructure sectors. So economic infrastructure sectors like energy, roads, urban and railways amount to a very high 70% of the total spend of 111 lakh crore. And then there are social infrastructure sectors like health and education and energy. Of course, if you see, this happens to be the largest pie of about 24%. It includes conventional power, includes renewables, oil and gas. And so that's really the breakup as far as the sectors is concerned. Now, who's going to spend this? So the NIP envisages that almost 40% of it is going to be the central government as the implementing agency. By central government, I mean the various ministries as also the central PSUs, and then another 40% with the state governments, and followed by the private sector of about 20%. The private sector participation is really focused on some of these sectors like roads, renewables, telecom, sectors like railways and urban, which again are large spends. There has been no meaningful private sector participation so far, but obviously the intent is for private participation to come into these sectors. Urban, of course, there are various subsectors within urban, like water is a major emerging subsector. Affordable housing is another subsector within urban. And the spends on other sectors like irrigation and rural infrastructure will almost be entirely out of the central and the state government budgets. So one of the other interesting facts which I thought I'll highlight to you is that out of this total 111 lakh crore spend, a large chunk of it is already in progress. So specifically 40% of the projects, almost 44 lakh crores out of this 111 is already under implementation. These are projects where the construction is already in progress, and another 20% or 22 lakh crore worth of projects are under development. What that means is that for these projects, we have the detailed project reports. They are ready, and these projects have either already achieved financial closure or have applied for financial closure. So 60% of the 111 lakh crore number, there is already progress on the ground, and another 30% is projects which are at conceptualization stage, where the projects have been announced but not yet awarded, and various activities like land acquisition, etc., are yet to start. So now the question to ask is that, how does this number 111 lakh crore over a 6-year period really stack up, as compared to the past? It certainly is quite ambitious compared to the run rate of the past. In the past, before COVID, India has been spending close to 5.8% of its GDP in infrastructure, and this is now set to go up to almost 7 to 8% of the GDP. And so therefore, certainly a step up from historical levels of spending. I would say that if this is to be achieved, there are two major areas where we have to break from the past. And these are really, these two areas are the key for this plan to fructify. The first of these is private sector participation. So private sector participation will have to significantly step up, and it is the states that will have to really attract private sector like never before. This has been a challenge because if you look at the last 3 years before COVID, private spending in infrastructure has stagnated. And in this context, the NIP itself lays down several reform measures that are needed to improve the PPP ecosystem. So, for example, improving project preparation processes, creating a more conducive enabling environment, and reforms which are focused on optimal risk sharing, sanctity and enforcement of contracts in PPP projects, and institutionalizing the dispute resolution process. So these are all aspects that have attracted a lot of attention of policymakers, and we have seen some progress in the last year or so in many of these aspects. Sectors like railways and urban infrastructure, where private spending have not really happened in a meaningful way, will therefore have to get their PPP ecosystems in place. Now, the second area which needs attention is the availability of capital. And as far as capital is concerned, when you look at the NIP, almost 80-85% of the NIP is envisaged to be financed through what I would say as traditional sources. So about 20% from the center's budget, 25% from the state's budget, that makes it 45%, and another 40% through extra budgetary resources and debt in the form of bond markets, from the banking system, debt from NBFCs, by way of equity from private developers, internal accruals of the PSUs, and of course, external aid from multilateral and bilateral agencies. Now, when equity and debt capital gets invested in projects like infrastructure, where assets have a very long economic life, unless we recycle this capital, it remains locked in for very long periods of time. And that's where the need for recycling of this capital comes in, and that's where asset monetization comes in. So the balance 15% of the NIP, the outlay is to be met through innovative and alternative initiatives. Asset monetization is one of them. Funding through a new developmental financial institution for infrastructure, a new DFI, is another such means. And as we know, asset monetization has now been suggested as an effective tool to monetize operational assets, both at center and as well as at state government levels. And last month, the National Monetization Pipeline, or NMP, has been released by the government, which targets a monetization of close to 6 lakh crores of assets. So if we have to get more capital, and more financial sector reforms are really required on revitalizing the bond and the credit markets, more innovative financing is needed. We've seen a very good success in innovative instruments like InvITs and REITs. We need more credit enhancement structures. And the most important thing is that states have to contribute to the monetization pipeline by recycling their assets. So in the end, I would like to conclude by saying that both the NIP as well as the NMP, which is the National Monetization Pipeline, both of them are programmatic and structured approaches to infra development. And these, along with the announcement of the developmental financial institution, they clearly signal a very strong intent on the part of the government to create a more holistic institutional approach and framework for financing of infrastructure. Thank you very much, and I will now invite my colleagues Sushmita and Tushar to talk about a couple of the larger sectors, roads and renewables. So over to you, Sushmita.
Thank you, Sudeep, for that succinct introduction to the NIP, its genesis, its vision, and its financing plan. Where road infrastructure has a significant role to play in the economic development of any country, and thus having a robust road network will be necessary to fuel India's economic growth. It's then no wonder that the second largest capital expenditure in the NIP is towards the road sector at about 18%. Now, this translates to over 20 trillion rupees, which is about 270 billion US dollars, and shared by both the center and the state. The center's portion of this would be about 65% or 13 lakh crore rupees, 155 billion USD. And that's towards just 1,820 projects, which are identified for national highways and expressways. State would be separate. India actually has the second largest road network the world over, with the status as on date showing national highways at about 1.3 lakh kilometers. This is expected to move up to about 2.2 lakh kilometers as per the NIP. However, private participation has been relatively muted at about 15 to 20% over the last few years. And the vision for 2025 is to increase this to close to 40%. Also part of the vision is the increased use of technology. We've seen some of this happening with the use of RFID tags, fast tags at toll booths, drones for monitoring, dedicated technologically enabled control rooms to reduce mishaps and accidents, and to increase health and safety on the roads. But talking about national highways alone, and this chart that you see is the trend in awarding and completion of national highways in the country over the last 5 years. And what we see is that though the awarding was lower in 2018 due to a focus on completion of stalled projects, there has been a steady focus on awards and completion on a year-on-year basis. In fact, despite the pandemic and the ensuing lockdowns, the pace of construction has been high at over 37 kilometers per day, with awards close to 11,000 kilometers in 2021. And a lot of this has actually been due to the government's push. One, in terms of releasing payments on time, enabling liquidity to contractors, waiving penalties, shifting milestones for delays during the pandemic, and such. Also to be mentioned is that the GST on construction equipment has been reduced from 28% to 18%, which is expected to give a further fillip to the sector. Now, to reach the vision for 2025, this pace would need to stay high and inch up to a rate of about 15,000 kilometers per year, which is 40 kilometers per day, up from today's pace of about 37 per day. Given that NHAI handles the bulk of the awarding for national highways, the graphs on this slide show awarding data for the NHAI. Now, while the awards have been increasing in the last few years, what we see in the graph on the left is actually that the modes of award have been primarily government funded. Now, the NHAI awards projects primarily on 3 modes. The first is the EPC, or the Engineering, Procurement and Construction mode, which is one that is fully funded by the government. And post-construction, the contractor hands over the project back to the NHAI for operations and maintenance. The second mode is the HAM, or the Hybrid Annuity model, wherein NHAI again pays milestone payments during the construction of the project, and it pays semi-annual payments for maintenance of the stretch to the contractor over the life of the concession. The third mode of award is the BOT, or the Build, Operate and Transfer mode, wherein a private developer takes on the construction and operations risk during the concession period. And this is in lieu of the license to collect toll on the project stretch. So what you see in the graph on the left is the awarding by the NHAI over the 3 years, with the innermost circle showing data for FY15 outwards onto FY20. And what is apparent is that the EPC mode, which is shown in purple, and the HAM mode, which is shown in dark blue, dominate the awarding. In fact, you will notice that for FY19 and 20, there is almost no BOT project that was awarded by NHAI. And this shows that private participation in the sector has actually drastically reduced from the period during 2012 and prior to that, where BOT was one of the most celebrated modes of award by NHAI. Now, but naturally, this has contributed to the bulk of the expenditure being borne by the government. And as you can see by the graph on the right, it has yielded in burgeoning debt on the books of NHAI. In fact, the graph shows you a quadrupling of debt over the last 4 years. Now, given that private developers are still wary of investing in the sector and government coffers are strained, especially given the impact of the pandemic, what then becomes key is asset monetization to unlock value and hence fuel growth in the sector. The two vehicles identified for this monetization by NHAI are InvITs, or Infrastructure Investment Trust, and TOT, or the Toll Operate Transfer mode, wherein a bundle of operational roads with little or no construction risk are bid out to interested developers. Now, these two modes, as per the NMP, or the National Monetization Plan, is expected to raise close to rupees 1.6 trillion, and that's about 22 billion US dollars over the next few years. The chart at the bottom shows you the phase-wise plan for raising these monies. In FY22, there is the plan of raising close to rupees 300 billion. And part of this is expected to be met through NHAI's first InvIT for 51 billion rupees and by a series of awards of TOT bundles. The table on the right shows us the track record of NHAI with regards to awarding of TOT bundles. And we can see that of the 5 bundles bid out so far, NHAI has seen success in 3 and has been able to raise about rupees 170 billion. Now, developers keen to invest and having the capacity for cutting these kind of big checks are quite limited as on date. And so the appetite for raising these monies as set out in the phasing plan will need to be tested in the days ahead. Now, this being said, with government coffers strained, if NHAI is to see success in achieving Vision 2025, private participation would be key. The graph on the left shows the declining trend of private participation in the road sector. And to stem this, NHAI has been taking steps to bring back private developers to the sector. And some of the key changes we have seen include changes in the concession agreements for BOT as well as HAM, where they have relooked at pain points like land acquisition, termination payments, linking the payments in the HAM model to the lending rate and not to the bank rate. We've also seen more transparency in operations, more engagement of NHAI when it comes to inputs and feedbacks from all stakeholders, be it investors, developers, and vendors. The impact of these changes and thus the return of private sector participation to the sector remains to be seen and will be key to ensure the success of Vision 2025. On that note, I'll now hand it over to Tushar, who will take you through the next big piece of the NIP story, the energy sector with a focus on renewables.
Thank you, Sushmita. So energy is one of the largest sectors in which NIP, the National Infrastructure Pipeline, has laid impetus on in terms of investments. So if we look at it, energy is around 24% of the total pipeline. That includes renewable power generation, power transmission and distribution, and oil and gas. And renewable energy is around 1/3 of that total investment at around 9 lakh crore or around 9,000 billion INR. Now, in terms of this slide, what we are talking about is, yeah, you can go back, Rohini. So in terms of the vision of NIP, the NIP talks about increasing the installed capacity from around 400 gigawatt currently to around 600 gigawatt over the next 5 years. And the RE share, the renewable share, will likely increase from around 25% today to around 39%. Now that is an increase from 94 gigawatt currently to around 265 gigawatt. What we have done here is while NIP takes into account progress from FY20, we have taken into account the current snapshot, which is up to FY21, and then we talk of the additional capacity which is yet to be installed, which is around 171 gigawatt. Now that includes around 109 gigawatt of solar, around 58 gigawatt of wind, and 4 gigawatt of hydro and biogas installations. This capacity installation will entail a capital expenditure of around $120 billion. Moving on. What we also see is that India's renewable capacity indeed over last 5 years has more than doubled. So the capacity installation as of March 21 was 94 gigawatts and has grown at a CAGR of around 15%, at a CAGR of around 15%. What needs to be also noted is for the first time, the solar installations or solar capacity has surpassed the wind capacity additions. Solar had a CAGR of around 42%, while wind had a CAGR of just about 8% in the period that has been shown on the graph on the left side. Further, the slowdown that we saw in the wind was driven by erratic payment behavior from DISCOMs, specifically for the wind players, the shift in the wind sector from feed-in tariff regime to an auction-based mechanism, and the falling tariff of solar compared to wind, which is something we also see on the graph on the right side, that wind tariffs have significantly fallen now, but solar, which is shown in the purple color, has been further low. So it has been around 2 rupees to be precise in the last auctions in the last year. And the overall growth in renewables has been driven by both government initiatives as well as the tariff competitiveness of the sector per se. So from a government initiative perspective, what we've really seen is while it started from renewable purchase obligations way back through policy initiatives, it was expanded through National Solar Mission, National Solar Wind Hybrid Policy, and various such initiatives, 12 gigawatt of CPSU schemes, and there are such other various drivers which government has facilitated to reduce, to increase the penetration of solar in the country, and that has really led to the kind of growth that we have already seen in the sector. Moving on. One of the biggest challenge that we see for the particular vision that we want to achieve from a renewable energy perspective is the counterparty risk. Because DISCOMs continue to be the weakest link in the entire power sector value chain from generation, transmission, and distribution. And the payment delays by the DISCOMs have been on an increasing trend for the renewable generators. So what we show on the graph in the left-hand side is that the renewable energy share, the billing, which was a per month billing, which was around 1.3 billion in April 2017, has significantly grown to around 16.3 billion per month over last 4 years. That increase of around 13x reflects in the growth in renewable generation which is happening. However, the receivables for the renewable generators, which were earlier around 4 months of overdue outstanding in around April 17, are now around 7 months of outstanding. Now, this is where the problem is. Similarly, the charts on the right side also reflect the same. The renewable generations, the share in generation is only about 9% in terms of units. However, their overdues from DISCOMs is around 15%. Now, this again compares with the payables, which are around 4 months for conventional power, which leads to a challenging situation for the renewable generators by and large. Moving on, another challenge is the financing of this vision or the growth pipeline. So as we estimated the total capital expenditure requirement, which is to the tune of $120 billion, it has to be funded with a mix of debt and equity. We have assumed here a debt of 70% and equity of 30%, which boils down to a requirement of around $84 billion from a debt perspective and $36 billion from an equity perspective. Now, on the debt side, the key dependence for this sector is tapping of capital markets. Now, this is obviously after the construction finance or the project finance status is completed, because as a sector, this is smaller gestation projects which are completed within 6 months, say for solar, versus a little higher for the wind sector. And then the key here is to tap the capital markets for financing of the debt capital. Now, what is also a mammoth capital requirement for this, the dependence on capital markets will continue to be high. We have already been seeing significant issuances of green and sustainable bonds. We have also seen various innovative structures being used in the market. There are covenanted protection which are built into on top of the structures because of the steady stream of cash flows. There have been issuances of long tenure capital market instruments. What they also achieve from these instruments is the cash flow profile of the asset of the project is matched with the profile, with the repayment requirements of the instrument per se. And what that does is releases a lot of equity capital for next round of growth. Now, issuances trend, which is shown in the graph, has been very positive. What we also see in the current financial year, in the current calendar year, the issuances have already surpassed more than double of what was issued in the full calendar year last year. Similarly, on the equity side, to bridge that huge funding gap, the sector has a huge dependence on FDI and other long-term capital flows. The sector has already seen a steady FDI inflows over last few years. So we see a consistent flow of around 1.5 billion US dollars as an FDI inflow in this sector. And further, what we are also seeing is sale of stake sale in operational portfolios and asset recycling, which is going to further fuel the growth requirement. From a national monetization pipeline perspective, the national monetization pipeline does not have huge expectations from solar and wind sector, largely because NTPC and Neyveli Lignite hold only about 2.5 gigawatt of renewable assets, and there is an expectation that there will be a fundraise of around just about 140 billion rupees from the national monetization, from the renewable sector for the monetization of the asset recycling, which is being estimated by the government. From an overall perspective, while this financing gap is huge and it requires investments to the tune of around 25 to 30 billion per year over next 4 years, this is one sector which has seen huge international investor interest, because the sector focuses on garnering positive impact from a sustainable development goal perspective for the country by and large, as well as for the environment. So it is the green credentials of the sector and the ESG readiness of the sector, which is leading to a significantly elevated international investor interest, and that can definitely help us achieve the vision. Moving on, some of the other measures which we believe are critical to achieve the vision under the NIP are taking care of the DISCOM's health. Now, under DISCOM's health, again, it needs to be a sustained improvement in the DISCOM health. So we have already seen a package of around 300 billion INR, which was announced very recently by the government, which includes outlay of around 100 billion INR from the government of India, as well as there's a support from the state governments as well. Now, continuing high receivables position for the renewable sector becomes a very high risk for international investors. Further, the must-run status, it needs to be reinforced to increase the investor confidence. The boosting of the manufacturing in India, the PLI incentives, which has been announced by the government, will further help reduce the import dependence and build large, huge domestic capabilities. From an investor value, from a regulatory perspective, in general, investors value the stability and certainty of a regulatory framework. Electricity Act 2003, which is the main guiding principle for the entire sector, has provided immense clarity over the years on the regulatory framework on the sector. However, any instances where PPAs, the sanctity of the contracts get challenged, or if there are unilateral bid or tender cancellations, that those are events which needs to be avoided. And once these things are taken care of, obviously the vision is a vision over a period of time, but definitely something which is achievable and will definitely help India become a 265 gigawatt renewable generation country. So thank you. So this is my part on the renewables. Before I move on, before I hand over to Rohini for the question and answers, a quick background on the company Care Advisory that we represent. So the company, from a services perspective, offers research services, which is we cover more than 50 sectors from a research perspective, industries and sectors. And from an advisory perspective, we provide advisory services in form of infrastructure advisory for stress assets and project advisories, etc. We also offer ESG assessment and ESG solutions. So this is broadly it. Thank you, and over to Rohini.
Thank you, Tushar, Sushmita, and Sudeep. I think it was a very great session on understanding what the National Infrastructure Pipeline entails, the aspects of roads and the renewable energy sector. I know there are a lot of questions pouring in from our audience. So I think I'll ask the first one. This is for Sudeep, and the question is, what has been the infrastructure spending in the last 7 years and how it compares with the NIP? What has been the current status of NIP and is it really achievable? What is the industry-wise impact? So Sudeep, do you want to take this one? I think this is for you.
Yeah, sure. So as I was saying when I was presenting, the total annual infra spend has been about 5.8% of GDP historically, and what the NIP envisions is a spend between 7 to 8% of GDP. If you look at it in terms of actual spend in the last 5-year period before COVID struck, from 2015 to 2019, we spent about 45 lakh crores. But in the last couple of years, this spend on a per annum basis had increased to about 10 lakh crores per annum. In the NIP, we are obviously envisioning a huge increase, a significant step up, almost to the extent of between 15 to 20 lakh crore per annum. But I would say that the couple of factors that really will determine this is going to be how fast we bounce back from COVID. Please remember that these numbers were in a pre-COVID scenario, and post-COVID in FY20 there was a significant contraction in the GDP. This year, rather FY21, now this year we are supposed to bounce back. So the pace of that bounce back is going to be very significant, number one. And as I said, the pace of private sector participation coming back into the PPP ecosystem in a major way, that's going to be the second aspect of it. And of course, how can we get in more capital, both foreign capital as well as domestic capital, into greenfield projects, as well as recycle the existing capital which is locked into the operational projects. So if we are able to do that, I don't think there is a dearth of capital for good projects. Projects have to be bankable. Projects have to be, from a credit worthiness point of view, they have to make sense. From an IRR point of view, they have to make sense. And if we have the right projects, I'm sure the capital will flow in. So yeah, that's what I want to say.
Thank you, Sudeep. I have another question for Tushar. This is on renewable energy. Is RPO beneficial for increasing the share of renewable energy in the total energy supply?
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
So yeah, RPOs as a process, the renewable purchase obligation, they made it mandatory for DISCOMs to purchase a certain share of power from renewable energy sources. So obviously, as a starting point, that is how we started getting into renewables, and then we had solar-specific RPO targets for DISCOMs under the National Tariff Policy, which was announced in 2011. So from there, we have traveled a long way through CERCs, SERCs, which issued various regulations. There was the concept of renewable energy credits framework. There was overall grid connectivity and forecasting for promoting solar energy. So over a period of time, obviously RPO was something which has helped and has led to today DISCOMs even committing to purchase obligations from a renewable perspective, which is beyond their RPO obligations. So as we saw in our presentation, that around 9% of energy today is being generated from renewable energy sources. So RPO obligations of around 10% are definitely something which is which is very near. But when there are utilities which have gone out and committed for 30% renewable offtake, renewable commitment, etc. So that is where we really take it beyond a single digit number. And just purchase obligations maybe just one element, but when the tariff itself is so competitive and overall ecosystem is facilitating the growth, then we may not continue to depend on RPO for that bit.
Okay. Thanks, Tushar. I have a question for Sushmita. What are the steps needed to encourage private participation in development of roads sector?
Sure. I think the main pain points when it came to private participation, or the issues or the roadblocks that were there in the past phase, I split it into two. One is during the construction period, and the second is during the operations period, right? During the construction period, the main pain point was land acquisition or land not being handed over in time. Now, what the NHAI has done in terms of changes to the concession agreement is to ensure that a project will not be handed over, or an appointed date will not be given to a private developer unless 90% of the land is already in place. That's one. Secondly, they've made a provision that if the rest of the land is not handed over in time, there would be an automatic de-scoping or delinking of that project portion prior to handing over to declaring the project complete. Yeah. So whatever is handed over to the developer is what they need to work on. That's one thing to do during the construction period. During the operations period, one of the pain points has been on termination payments, which they have relooked at in the new concession agreements. The other key issue had to do with the key risk of demand or traffic shortfall. And the older concessions had a clause where you could test for traffic in a 10-year period, right? And then NHAI would decide if the project gets an extension in the concession period or not. What they've done now is they've reduced that 10-year period to a 5-year period. So within every 5 years, there would be a testing of the project on the project stretch to ensure that if there is a shortfall, there is the extension that can be granted, which then automatically builds in some more flexibility for refinancing and gives the developers a cushion. So yeah, both on the construction as well as the operational phases of a project, there have been some mitigants that have been built into the new concession agreement.
Thank you, Sushmita. Sudeep, we have another question for you. It says, given the high gestation period in the infra space and the high cost of capital to ensure working capital requirements, what can be the low-cost financing options for private players, the smaller ones, to expand in this space?
Yeah. So, there are ample opportunities even for smaller ticket infrastructure projects. As I said in my presentation, this is a compilation of projects which are 100 crores or more. Even outside of the NIP, there will be infrastructure projects which are costing lower than 100 crore. But even if I look at the NIP itself, there will be projects pertaining to affordable housing, for example, in urban infrastructure. There will be projects pertaining to smart city mission, which are street lighting projects, solid waste management projects, water supply projects, and so on and so forth, right? So there will be urban infrastructure in particular would comprise of a lot of small capital, small sized projects. And of course, like I said, outside of NIP, there will be a number of projects. In other social infrastructures also, for example, in education, there will be projects pertaining to schools, there will be projects pertaining to colleges. Depending on the risk appetite of the private sector, depending on the gestation period, and depending on the size of the project, this actually provides ample investment opportunities for all kinds of investors.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sudeep. There's actually another question for you. It says, is medical infrastructure not a part of this plan? As far as I know, it is. Would you like to give?
Yes, medical infrastructure most certainly is a part of this plan. If you look at social infrastructure, there are two parts to social infrastructure. The first one is education, and in healthcare, we have medical colleges, upgradation of medical colleges. We have new AIIMS which are being set up. We have construction and setting up of OPDs, special medical blocks, hostel blocks. So if you look at this in totality, you have in the healthcare sector, you have significant opportunities for investments.
Thank you, Sudeep. And one more for you. Can you elaborate on the state's recycling of assets?
Right. So, so asset recycling, as I mentioned, is a very good tool for governments to unlock the capital, unlock capital in the form of equity, as well as the extra budgetary resources that have gone into the project. We have seen success of asset monetization and asset recycling primarily in the area of roads, through TOT, like Sushmita had presented in for the NHAI projects. We have seen asset recycling happen for airports. We have seen it happen for telecom towers. We have seen it happen for power transmission lines through InvITs. So therefore, when you look at the state governments, states are also owning a lot of infrastructure assets that are amenable to this kind of recycling. Primarily, they would be power transmission lines, and there will be road projects. So we know that in power transmission, because of the stability of the revenues, and because of the fact that it's a very long, stable sort of an asset, it really is attractive to long-term, asset holders like insurance companies and pension funds. Similarly, on the road side, when it comes to state toll roads or even state annuities, they are again amenable to monetization. I'm specifically talking about these two sectors because we have seen the success in these two sectors in the recent past. But of course, if we apply our minds, there will be other infrastructure sectors where asset recycling is also possible. One has to keep in mind what is the right mode. It's not necessary that we are going to have a one-size-fits-all approach. We can't really have an InvIT for all sectors. We can't have a TOT for all sectors, but we'll have to tweak the mode through which we recycle the asset. But I think it definitely is time that states look at asset recycling in a very, very serious manner.
Thank you, Sudeep. And now, since we are on the topic of finances, there's a question for you, Tushar. Well, given the health of states wherein the account of pandemic, their finances are under stress, do you foresee the health of state finances as a stumbling block to the NIP?
Yeah, so I think the national monetization pipeline, which was very recently released, takes care of this to an extent. And I'm just taking cues from what Sudeep already spoke about. So, I think what is key is asset monetization, and what happens is you have to create additional capital capacity. Capacity to create assets will come out of capacity. You have to create capital in terms of by monetization of these assets. So if you look at what the national monetization pipeline talks about, there is an additional allocation which is equivalent to around 33% of the value of assets which is realized, which will be deposited in the state consolidated fund by the government of India based on the asset monetization which is done by the state. The only condition there is that the asset monetization proceeds are again used for capital expenditure by the states. So what indeed that takes care of is that the funds which are provided to the states are used for long-term infrastructure creation. There is an incentive, added incentive, which is being provided to the states. And what that also does is, while state government finances, I agree that there is only limited capacity there, but there are various segments of assets, and all of these we can talk of power transmission lines owned by the state government, the road assets owned by the state government. So what needs to be done is asset monetization and create additional capacity for new asset creation. And that will obviously, a lot of it will be beyond the finances that we are looking at, beyond the state's own tax revenues that we are looking at. And it will help create asset, which has a multiplier effect on the economy.
Thanks, Tushar. And I think we have time for just one last question. This is on the power sector. It says power sector receivables at rupees 1.2 lakh crores or 1.2 trillion, and this continues to be high. What steps can be undertaken to reduce this amount, as otherwise prospective investors may be concerned about the fortunes of the sector?
Correct. So two things there. One is again during my presentation I did speak about that while overall receivables for the power sector for the generators continue to be high, we see that renewable further is at a receiving end because their receivables are further higher. What I would say that the fiscal health or the financial position of the DISCOMs is indeed a challenge. However, if you look at initiatives from the government, if you look at the announcement in June, which I did briefly speak about, now from a reforms perspective, what is being looked at is a reform-based, result-oriented distribution sector scheme. Now, where all of these DISCOMs will have a very specific resolution, very specific implementation plan, a roadmap to success, where obviously from a long-term perspective, the targets are that your AT&C losses should be just about low teens. Your tariff should be reflective of the cost, as in the ACS, the average cost of supply minus the revenue recognition should be zero. And further, you modernize your or increase efficiencies in terms of smart metering, feeder separations, and all of that. So there are various such initiatives. There is a lot of amount which is devolved coming from the central government. A lot of states skin into the game, and a monitoring as well. And this is result linked and reform based. So probably I would say I would expect that some of these schemes on a continuous basis are going to be very important to really help the generators by and large, because the DISCOM's health will improve over a period of time. Further, I think from a protection of an investor perspective, what it entails is, end of the day, it's a working capital issue. So what happens is, say, if I look at a renewable player and if I see what it has transitioned is from a 4-month receivable to a 7-month receivable cycle. So as long as you are, or one is investing from a long-term capital for the asset which has been created, what we also need is an additional cushion in form of a working capital, which is funded either in form of a cash credit line from a lender, or in form of, say, a 6-month, 9-month DSRA, debt service reserve account, which is put in the asset in the cash flow structure. In the waterfall, what happens is that is a protection which is there. So while there may be DISCOMs delays here and there may be payments which will come with a delay, but that cash or that liquidity in the system will protect that investor from a potential delay. Now, all of this, we just need to understand that all of these are delays; these are not defaults. So while albeit it comes, albeit with a delay. So we just need to manage it through a working capital facility, through liquidities which can be put in the system, and possibly that should get comfort to the investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tushar. As we have reached our 1-hour mark, we will be closing today's session. We'll answer all of the remaining questions in writing, and we'll get back to each of you via email shortly. I hope this webinar was interesting to all of you, and it has provided you with valuable insights on the national infrastructure pipeline and its role in building the $5 trillion economy for India. Now, for the additional details on current situation and key trends in infrastructure, I would also encourage you to review recently published regional reports on Asia, Latin America, and individual country reports on all of these different sectors on key emerging markets on our EMAS platform. I would also invite you to review our flagship publications of ISI In addition to the industry reports, we publish the CIC macroeconomic reports, which each quarter offer a comprehensive overview and outlook of the world's largest economies using our proprietary CIC leading indicator. And we also have our half-annual updates. These are specific to India, which are published on a half-annual basis as a follow-up to the annual publications in 9 key industries. Thank you very much. I would encourage you to visit our dedicated webinar pages in both EMIS and CIC, where you can find recordings of all our webinars and register for our upcoming events. Thank you very much for your attention and stay tuned for upcoming events. See you soon. Bye.